this moment in time from the 1760s, early 1760s. This is when the British and the French stopped their war with each other, into the 1770s. So that decade, the British Empire says to the colonists, right, we're going to tax you. We need money. You're part of the British Empire. To use a modern parlance, you got to pay your fair share. And the colonists respond, wait a minute. If you're going to tax our property, remember the famous phrase, it wasn't no taxation. It was no taxation without representation. We have to be represented in Parliament. We have to have a voice. We can't just be suckers sitting here having our property taken from us with no say in how these things are done. We want representation.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential. And here's your host, Jeff Crank.
All right, well, thank you for joining us on another episode of American Potential. Today on Independence Day, for the greatest nation on the face of the earth. I'm so excited about the topic today, and I hope that you will spend the day today celebrating the liberty, the freedom that you enjoy because you live in the United States of America. We're going to talk about the founding of our country and what a great political experiment it started as, and it has turned out to be. You know, on June 7th, 1776, the following resolution was introduced to the Second Continental Congress. And it said that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. From this, a committee was formed to draft the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. With a little over 1,300 words, it declared the colonies were free from Great Britain. This document, primarily written by Thomas Jefferson, not only announced the colonies' separation from British rule, but also set the framework for the principles of individual liberty and governed by consent. The Declaration of Independence emphasized that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And as the colonies united under a common cause, the Declaration ignited a sense of shared identity and purpose, laying the groundwork for the development of the United States Constitution. And so today, as we celebrate our Independence Day, we want to take time to talk about the summer of 1776 and how the courageous decisions and visionary ideas of that period continue to shape and inspire our nation's commitment to freedom and to opportunity. And I want to welcome Dr. Tom Krannawitter, who holds a PhD from the School of Politics and Economics at the Claremont Graduate University in California, and he's also the founder of Speak Easy Ideas. Dr. Krannawitter, thank you for being with us.
Hey, Jeff, thank you for having me. Happy Independence Day to everyone listening.
That's right.
And we would be remiss if we didn't jump right on that wonderful little historical nugget. You read that resolution that was introduced in June, that was introduced by Richard Henry Lee. And here's what's fascinating. There has been some dispute ever since that summer of 1776 about what really the date of what Independence Day should be, because that resolution and that the one that says these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, right, that was actually adopted on July 2nd. That's right, July 2. And none other than John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail and said, "Oh, my dear Abigail, what a wonderful day. You know, we've officially declared independence. Forever after, on July 2nd, Americans will celebrate with parades and fireworks, right? and all of this. We get the official Declaration of Independence, a much more formal, Richard Henry Lee's resolution simply asserted we're independent. That's it. The Declaration of Independence gives an argument why. It explains why these Americans are declaring their independence. And curiously, it incorporates the text of Richard Henry Lee's resolution into the formal Declaration of Independence. That very last paragraph has that language from Richard Henry Lee built right into the Declaration of Independence. So in a way, Henry Lee's resolution was passed twice. It was passed on July 2nd, and then it got passed again, enshrined in the Declaration on July 4th.
Yeah. Wow, that's fascinating. I mean, it would have been amazing to be alive at that time and everything that was going on in that summer of 1776. It's fascinating. Just what a historic time, not only for America, but like for the world. I mean, talk about the importance of the Declaration of Independence and the founding of this nation and what it meant for the world.
Truly, historical and philosophic, what we are witnessing, not merely one group of people fighting with another group of people trying to separate themselves. Conflicts like that have been going on since the beginning of human nature. But what was truly unprecedented, there was no model for this, nothing like this had ever been done, was a revolution sparked by an idea. This idea that had never actually been realized everywhere. This idea that every human being actually does have, this is the part that's real in the Declaration. Each human being by nature, because every one of us has a body. We have a physical body, material, by bones and blood and skin, and it is the home to a free mind. Each one of us has a free mind. My mind has the capacity to govern my body. That's why I'm responsible for the choices I make, and your mind, of course, is responsible for the choices your body makes with the actions of your body. So the seeds of self-government are sown right into human nature itself. Each of us, as an individual human being, has the capacity for self-government. And here's what had never been done. These Americans said we should take that idea as the premise of what government should be. It means only political and constitutional self-government is legitimate government. Every other kind of government, some sort of, whether it's a king or a pharaoh or a Caesar, give them any title you want, when it's one person or some small group of people lording over others without their permission, that the Americans said that's illegitimate in all forms. All the pomp and ceremony aside, right? All the kings and pharaohs and those types love to adorn themselves with crowns and jewels and regal cloaks. He said, that's all wrong. Based on human nature, the only kind of rightful government is a government by the consent of the governed. And they set up this goal based on an idea. Now, that had never been done. You think of some of the most famous, foundings in all of history. We find one in the old books of the Bible, right? And Cain and Abel go and form a society. How do they do it? Well, one murders his brother. You look at the founding of Rome, one of the greatest empires, right, in all of history. Rome, its grandeur, its glory. How does Rome begin? Well, it begins again with two brothers, Romulus and Remus, and one murders the other. And when you have those kinds of foundings in murder and blood and injustice, you tend to cover those kinds of foundings up with all kinds of myths and stories. But the Americans say, our revolution is justified by this idea, these self-evident truths. And we don't know if we can ever live up to them. We don't know if we can actually win this revolution and become an independent sovereign nation. And even if we do that, we don't know that we can create a self-governing, just society that will operate by the consent of citizens and simultaneously offer equal protection of the laws for the equal natural rights of everyone who lives here. these are great challenges. This had never been attempted before, but they said, by golly, let's try it. Let's try it. And they set out the moral case for self-government in the Declaration of Independence. In a way, there's no document that exists like that on the face of the planet. And here's the other thing, Jeff, to keep in mind. When they were doing that in the summer of 1776, so if we go back and rewind a little bit, remember there was a long history of dispute. Maybe we'll talk more about this. The British had been fighting a long global world war, truly the first world war against the French Empire. And the British had emerged victorious and broke. I mean, it had cost them everything to fight. They were fighting naval battles on all the major seas, and they were fighting on all the continents around the world. And so the British Empire sitting there thinking, oh, we need to restock our coffers. We need money. Where can we get money? And they're looking at their own colonies, and especially those colonies in North America. And they're thinking, wow, those people are really productive. They're growing in terms of population. They're growing in terms of productivity, their GDP. I mean, they're making all kinds of things and selling it around the world. Let's start taxing them. And there was the rub. There's the first little friction, because those colonists, most of them had never experienced a tax at all. And the ones who had were very localized. An example was Ben Franklin, for example, set up the first municipal fire department in Philadelphia. And there was a tiny, tiny little tax that the residents of Philadelphia paid to fund this municipal fire department. Those are the only taxes they ever knew. They were tiny, and they were with their direct consent. And all of a sudden, this government on the other side of the ocean, right, is saying, we're going to tax your property. We're going to tax your wealth. We're going to tax your tea and your stamps and all these things. And like, wait, we're not even represented in Parliament. You don't have the rightful moral authority to tax us. That's the framework behind the conflict, behind all this. And the British decide to impose their will starting in early 1775. They start sending ships. They start sending soldiers. The first real heated conflict breaks out. Everyone remembers the battles of Lexington and Concord. That was April of 75. So by the time we get to the Declaration of Independence, the fighting has been going on for well over a year, almost a year and a half. And throughout most of that early period, so the summer of 75, the fall of 75, early 1776, people like George Washington still considered themselves to be loyal Englishmen, subjects of the British crown. They were unhappy. They were discontented. They had grievances, and they wanted those grievances addressed. But they weren't yet talking about full-blown independence. When they finally make that decision, they think, okay, enough is enough. We're never going to get justice being part of the British Empire. So the time is now to simply separate and become an independent sovereign nation. If you were a betting person and you were looking at that conflict in July of 76 between this ragtag group of revolutionaries, and remember, of all the colonists involved, only about a third actually supported the revolution, and only a few percent actually fought in the revolution. So it's a tiny, tiny cadre of people there making the revolution happen. And what are they going up against? Oh my goodness, they're going up against the greatest army that the world had ever seen. Is to think of all the great armies, the Roman armies. Think of what Genghis Khan did. Think of all of them. And the army that puts them all to shame is the British Army. The British Army could do what no army had ever done. And it also was supported by a navy, the Royal Navy, which could project power. I mean, anywhere you could sail a boat. You could not escape the British, because while they had the greatest army in the world, they also had the greatest navy in the world. And anywhere you could sail, they could sail too. And it was formidable. No one wanted to mess with the British Army and the Navy. And these revolutionaries have this voluntary army it's not even an army. It's mainly a bunch of young boys, 17, 18, 19 years old, who would get hooched up on corn whiskey and all full of bravado at night. And then the next morning they would go march out onto a field and they'd see thousands of redcoats all lined up in perfect formation. And those redcoats, every one of them had a musket, and they were they were good marksmen. They could shoot accurately. They could reload fast. And what was terrifying about the redcoats, they had this interesting feature at the end of the bayonet. They had a razor sharp piece of steel around 2.5, 3 feet long. And what the British would do better than any army on the face of the planet is they would march up to people in large numbers, thousands of them, and they would slice your bowels open. And if you were on the receiving end, you would look down and you would see your guts spill onto the ground, and then you would lose consciousness and collapse and die. And that's what they did. And that's how they won wars. And these Americans, my point of all this is, they had no reason to think they could win. George Washington was writing these desperate letters to the Continental Congress saying, this is suicide. We can't win this war with this thing called the Continental Army. We need much more. We need more men, more training, more resources, more guns, more cannons, more of anything. We can't win like this. And yet they produce a Declaration of Independence saying, we deserve to win. Justice is on our side. Self-government is right. Even if we don't have the might to win this conflict, we think we're on the side of right. We're on the side of justice. And that's what the Declaration of Independence is. It's a moral justification. It's a moral argument for self-government written by a group of revolutionaries at a very desperate, dark moment.
Wow. Yeah. You painted an amazing picture. How did the colonies really try to resolve these issues? I mean, they tried to resolve them with the king prior to the Declaration of Independence. What were they trying to do to resolve, and why wasn't it working?
For an entire decade.
Right.
These disputes were going back and forth. It's fascinating. I'm a student of political philosophy, and so I spent a lot of time reading the great political thinkers, the ancients, people like Plato and Aristotle, and more modern thinkers. And this moment in time from the 1760s, early 1760s, this is when the British and the French stopped their war with each other, into the 1770s. So that decade, the British Empire says to the colonists, right, we're going to tax you. We need money. You're part of the British Empire. You to use a modern parlance, you got to pay your fair share. And and the colonists respond, wait a minute. If you're going to tax our property, remember the famous phrase, it wasn't no taxation. It was no taxation without representation. We have to be represented in Parliament. We have to have a voice. We can't just be suckers sitting here having our property taken from us with no say in how these things are done. We want representation. The British respond in a brilliant way. They say, we agree with you. We agree you should be represented. And here's the good news. You're all English subjects, and every English subject in the entire British Empire is represented by Parliament. Parliament represents the interests of all the British Empire. So you are their phrase, you are virtually represented. And then of course the colonists come back and they're like, we're not buying it. No. We want actual direct representation. Now here's where the rub really is. The population growth had greatly stagnated for many reasons on the island of England. There was very little population growth. The population growth in North America was booming. booming, north and south. Cities like Boston, southern states like South Carolina, their populations were doubling every few years. And so had the British Empire extended to these colonies actual representation, based on population, by most calculations of historians, within 2 to 3 generations, the colonists would have a majority in Parliament. They would control Parliament, or at least the lower house, the popular house. And so the British, right, they could not allow, not if they wanted to retain control of their own government, they could not allow some sort of populist representation by these colonists. And so when the colonists in the course of this fight over representation, the colonists initially were making arguments on the what do I want to say, in the form of the rights of Englishmen. According to English tradition, we are English subjects, and according to Magna Carta and the whole tradition of English common law, we deserve these rights as Englishmen, as English subjects. When the British kind of exhaust that line of thought and say, well, there have been English subjects for centuries, and their representation is through the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and that's the same with you guys. That's when these colonists switch and they stop talking about the rights of Englishmen, and they start talking about the natural rights of human beings, natural rights that every human being has, not merely English subjects. And that's the moment where the teachings of people like John Locke become pivotal, because we're no longer talking about political concepts within the limited framework of British tradition. Now, all of a sudden, we're talking about natural rights every human being has. And that's when they start making the claim, you have no right to my property. That's my personal property. I earned it. I decide what happens. You cannot govern me without my consent, regardless of whether I'm an Englishman or anyone else. And of course, many people maybe see this coming. That line of argument that we are human beings and therefore we have a natural right to our own person, our own property, our own labor, our own freedom. You, the English, you can't lord over. You have no rightful authority to lord over us and restrict our liberty or take our property. These colonists are in possession of large numbers of African slaves. And that doesn't escape the attention. Everyone notices that. The British notice that. And to their credit, these colonists notice that. And so very literally, before the ink was dried on the Declaration of Independence, thoughtful colonists are realizing, wow, the same argument we're making that justifies our own independence, our own separation from the British, requires that we abolish the practice of slavery. Mm-hmm. And so the Declaration of Independence not only signifies the separation between these colonies and the British Empire, it simultaneously ignites the greatest anti-slavery movement in all of human history. Hands down, nothing comes close. Nobody else comes close to what these Americans did within, let's put it this way, within 2 generations after declaring their own independence. And remember, that was no easy thing. They didn't merely declare it. They had to win their independence, which meant beating the greatest army and navy on the face of the planet. So they had a gigantic challenge in front of them, and victory was far from guaranteed, no one knew if these revolutionaries would be successful. Within 2 generations of that, the Americans abolish the most heinous institution ever invented in human history by way of a civil war followed by a constitutional amendment. It's amazing.
Right. Yeah. It is amazing. In fact, as I understand it, and I know you'll shed more light on this, one of the initial drafts of the Declaration of Independence, one of the grievances listed was that the king would not allow the colonies to abolish the slave trade. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. So you rightfully mentioned earlier when you opened the podcast that Richard Henry Lee had introduced this resolution, and that resolution was, by the way, we should mention this too. That resolution was not passed for almost a month, and the reason it wasn't passed is there were still some key states, including New York. New York was a big deal in the American Revolution. They were not persuaded for independence. They were disgruntled, right, upset colonists who were disgusted with what the king had done. They were disgusted with how Parliament had behaved. They were disgusted with their fellow Englishmen in England. But this idea of let's declare independence, full-blown independence, that was treason from the British point of view. Remember, we talk a lot today about birthright citizenship. The British Empire was based on birthright subjectship. If you were born, it didn't matter who your parents were. If you were born on the property owned by the British Empire, owned by the crown sovereign king, you owed a lifetime of loyalty to the king. There was no expatriation. There was no the idea that, oh, well, I don't want to be a British subject anymore. I'm just gonna renounce my subjectship and go move somewhere. No. There was treason. You couldn't do that. That was illegal according to English law. And so this is this is the framework here. And a lot of the states had not yet concluded that full independence was the right thing to do. Well, so they're debating this in June, first few days of July, 1776. And as you pointed out, they assign a committee. And that committee it's an all-star committee. Livingston is on that committee. Roger Sherman's on there. Benjamin Franklin is on that committee. The two most important figures, Thomas Jefferson is on the committee, and John Adams. And we got the declaration we got because John Adams, in probably one of the finest moments of his life, John Adams was a man of towering, enormous ego. And kind of rightly so. I mean, John Adams was something of a genius, and he was a prickly, there's probably a word I want to use that I shouldn't use on the podcast. Many people disliked John Adams personally. He was not an easy man to be around or be friends with. And he went to Thomas Jefferson. And he said, look, Tom, you should write the draft of the Declaration of Independence for two reasons. Number one, you are 10 times a better author than I am. Oh, and that had to pain John Adams to admit that. He was right. Thomas Jefferson was a more poetic writer than Adams was. And then Adams pointed out, I'm John Adams, and almost everybody hates me. And if it's known that I write this document, a lot of people are going to reject it regardless of what the document says. They're just going to reject it because they hate me. At that time, in the summer of 1776, Thomas Jefferson was relatively unknown, especially outside of Virginia. He was a very quiet, meek little guy, and most people in North America had never even heard of Thomas Jefferson at that point. So he was relatively a safe bet to author this important document. There wasn't a lot of animosity or anger aimed at Thomas Jefferson. So he ends up writing the first draft. Now that draft, it gets edited and changed. It's largely the final product. What we know is, for the most part, Jefferson's words. But one of the most important edits, if you remember in the middle part of the Declaration, Jefferson lists all these grievances against the king. The king quartering troops in our homes and taxing our properties without our consent. And in that list of grievances, the longest grievance, far and away the longest, was for establishing the international slave trade within colonies in North America. Jefferson said that was the king. We didn't do that. He did that. Of course, he had, great vested interests in these British trading companies that ran the slave trading ships. And it got so bad when Jefferson himself was in the House of Burgess. That was the colonial Virginia, so still part of the British Empire. It's a colony. They had a little colonial legislature. The king and parliament would allow them to pass legislation on certain local matters. Now, of course, the king and the parliament had ultimate veto power over that because they're a colony of the British Empire. And the House of Burgess attempted to just restrict the importation of slaves from the Atlantic slave trade. And George III vetoed that. Would not let them restrict the importation of slaves. So that's what Jefferson was talking about in that document. You, the king, you are the one, you're offering protection for this nefarious trade on international waters. The Royal Navy serves to protect British trading ships for this practice where human beings, and here's what's interesting, in that denunciation of the king for the slave trade, he points out that the international slave trade is a trade where men, and Jefferson capitalizes all three letters, MEN, where men are bought and sold as if they're property. They're treated as if they're property, but they're not. They're human beings. Now, you go back and look at that famous second paragraph, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And then you look at Jefferson's line about King George and slavery. And he says all these Africans are men. And then you ask the obvious question, well, does Thomas Jefferson realize that African slaves are human beings who have all the same natural rights as every other human being? And the answer is, darn right he does. Absolutely. Which is why Jefferson himself becomes one of the loudest proponents for abolition, pointing out time and time again. He helps to author the Northwest Ordinance that, I don't have a map here handy, but if you think of a map of the United States, right, and you have the eastern seaboard, that's where America begins, and you spread westward. Right in the middle, that whole upper section where states like Ohio and Indiana and Michigan, right, that whole area was originally the Northwest Territory before they became states. It was the Northwest Territory, and Jefferson helps secure a provision that the Northwest Territory forbids the spread of slavery. Slavery can exist in the original states where it already existed because a lot of people have a lot of interest in it, but it cannot exist in the new territory where Americans are heading out west. At the same time, Jefferson as president. So, we got to fast forward here a little bit. He gets elected in the election of 1800 and then again in 1804. And as president, Jefferson signs in legislation that forever forbids the importation of slaves. One of the big fights in the Constitutional Convention, so I'm switching here from the Declaration of the Constitution. In the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, one of the big fights was over the importation of slaves from the Atlantic slave trade, most of whom were African slaves. And the two big arguments were delegates from southern states like Georgia and South Carolina. They said, look, our constituents want to be able to buy slaves very cheaply. And the way we preserve a cheap market for slaves is to have a big supply of slaves. And the biggest supply in the world is the west coast of Africa. So we want to keep the slave trade open forever. And people like Hamilton respond. This is during the Constitutional Convention. The slave trade's horrific. It is so disgustingly immoral and cruel, including some 15 to 20% of the people on those slave ships don't even make it to their destination. They die during the passage across the Atlantic Ocean. And these delegates say we should abolish the importation of slaves right now, instantly. And so there are the big fights, right? Let the importation of slaves go on forever, and let's abolish it instantly. They reach a compromise of 20 years. They say, okay, the importation of slaves can exist for another 20 years, and then Congress may, if they want to, they may restrict or prohibit it. Well, they do prohibit it. And the president at that time is none other than Thomas Jefferson, who signs the legislation forever prohibiting the importation of slaves. Now, I look at that. You have anti-slavery movements within all the original states. Half of those original states, places like New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, half of the original states abolished slavery between 1776 and 1800. That's only 24 years. They abolished slavery. There's active anti-slavery movement within the other states, even places like Georgia and South Carolina. So the founders have confined slavery to where it existed at the time of the Revolution. They've stopped slavery from spreading into new territories, and they've stopped the supply of slaves from the international slave trade. My metaphor for that is they treat slavery kind of like a cancer. Isolate it where it is, stop it from spreading, stop feeding it, stop supplying it, and then work to get rid of it within the original states as best we can. That is the greatest anti-slavery movement in all of history. And I want to offer to our listeners here a little juxtaposition, a different view of this. Think of the African view. The African slave trade stretches over about 4.5 centuries, and it concludes in the late 1800s. It begins in the 1400s. So 400 years. Over the course of 400 years, about 12.5 million human beings from Africa are sold and put onto slave trading ships. Initially, those ships mostly were Portuguese and Spanish, and then eventually the British and the French got in, and some others too. But the slaves who were sold were all Africans, all of them, 12.5 million Africans. And they were slaves while they stood on African soil. Before they were put on a boat, they were already enslaved because they had already been kidnapped by fellow Africans. There were entire tribes on the west coast of Africa. Maybe the most notorious was the Ashanti tribe, who specialized, get this, Jeff, their specialty as a tribe was not growing corn or, weaving cloth and making, no. Their specialty was kidnapping and enslaving fellow Africans. They would go raid tribes and villages nearby and kill a lot of men, capture children and women, and physically put them in shackles or tie them up, bring them to slave trading posts on the west coast of Africa and sell them, auction them off to international slave traders. Now, that practice went on for centuries. The international trade of slavery in Africa. And before the international trade, there's thousands of years of domestic slavery in Africa. And meaning Africans enslaving fellow Africans. And in all that time, there was no great public political movement to abolish slavery. You might have individual slaves trying to escape slavery because they don't like being a slave, but there was no public awareness. We got to get rid of this institution. It's inherently immoral. The Americans developed this moral understanding, this moral critique. And of course, they have a big fight over it, a fight that eventually boils over into the Civil War. But large numbers of Americans say, it's not merely that I personally don't want to be a slave. We think this practice is deeply shameful. It's repulsive. It's immoral. We need to get rid of it. We need to abolish it. That's why we have an abolition movement here in the United States. that didn't exist in most nations, most cities throughout most of history.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question. And I want to ask a question because this is so fascinating. I'm going to have you back because we haven't even covered half of the questions that I have for you, Dr. Krannawitter. But as you talk about that, and maybe we can be quick here because I do have another real important question about the Declaration of Independence after this one. But as people look at what happened, how do you reconcile the fact of someone like Thomas Jefferson or someone who is a slave owner in the United States? And that's always where people start, is the founding fathers owned slaves.
Yeah.
How do you rectify that, the fact that they did in fact own slaves in a world that had slaves, with the fact that, as you point out, they rightfully wanted the abolition of slavery and the abolition of the slave trade? How do you reconcile those?
I say it's one of the greatest blessings in all of history. There have been unknown millions of slave owners. And of all those slave owners, stretching over thousands of periods of years, of all those slave owners, how many of them told the world all men are created equal? How many of them launched a revolution on behalf of the rights of human nature, rights that all human beings have? How many slave owners stood up and said, man, I grew up in this culture where slavery was the norm, and I've benefited from it myself, and I think it's deeply wrong. I'm going to do everything I can to encourage others to get rid of this institution. Any movement toward abolition, I'm going to encourage that. I'm going to support that. And he did throughout his life. We modern Americans, well, not those who listen to this podcast, but many modern Americans, especially the types you find teaching in political science departments and history departments and anthropology departments in our universities, those types and their students, they have this moral arrogance about them, right? That they just can't believe that the world was less than perfect ever, and that somebody didn't do exactly what was just. And yet it turns out, when you look through history, very few people stand up for justice. Very few people stand up for what is right, especially when it's convenient and profitable to just say nothing, to just be quiet and go along to get along, and have things like slavery or any other kind of cruel, unjust practice. That's the way most people have lived throughout most of their lives. Big, radical, overturning social change like abolishing slavery, that's rare. And so I look at that and think, my goodness, the people who did that, we owe them such a debt. Thank you. Whether it's an Alexander Hamilton who never had slaves, and yet he was one of the great promoters of abolition, or a Thomas Jefferson who was born into a slave-owning family, both of them led this charge for moral reform, social reform, cultural reform, political, legal reform. Let's get rid of this practice of slavery and all the cultural, tentacles that come with it. Let's change the way we live. And yet we have these arrogant modern Americans say, well, they didn't do enough, or they didn't act quickly enough, or they didn't have a pure enough heart when
right.
Really? Wait, here's the way I would summarize it, Jeff. If you compare the early Americans to the level of perfection, if you compare early Americans to angels, then the early Americans fall short. No doubt about it. They were not angels. They were not perfect. If you compare the early Americans to any other group of human beings anywhere throughout all of recorded history, they shine. It is unbelievable how much good they did. And we should remind people, not only did they get rid of slavery quickly, that was not the only injustice they were solving. They also replaced a monarchy with a self-governing constitutional republic. They enshrined the idea of property rights into fundamental law here in the United States. They adopted a constitution under which there are no titles of nobility, right? No more dukes and barons and princes and none of that. They got rid of all that. And they set up the standard of equal protection of the laws for the equal rights of all citizens and make it a moral imperative to get rid of slavery. They did all of that. And can you believe that there are some snotty little modern Americans who say, well, they didn't do enough? Really? They did more than anybody else had ever done.
All right. Yeah. Yeah, no question. And again, we're going to have you back. I mean, we might do 2 more episodes just to talk through. There's just so much here.
There is a lot.
But I do have a final question for you. And it's really, as we reflect on Independence Day, on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the founding of our nation, how do the principles that were in the Declaration of Independence and the principles then enshrined in the Constitution, how do they continue to sort of address political and social issues of today?
Well, I think one of our greatest problems, our greatest challenges today is that as a nation of citizens, we have largely abandoned those principles. There aren't many. There are small pockets. Your listeners are an elite group who actually care about the principles of the American founding, the principles of the Declaration of Independence. It's been one of my mission in life is to inspire, encourage, teach fellow Americans that those self-evident truths enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. Every human being is endowed by their Creator with an unalienable right to your own life, your own liberty, your own pursuit of happiness. Those kinds of principles, they're true. They actually are self-evident truths. They're real. They are the foundation of justice. If we are to have any kind of justice within our laws, justice within how we treat each other as fellow citizens, how we treat others around the world, fellow human beings, it has to be based on those principles because those principles are true and are the foundation of all good things, of all just relationships between human beings. We have an educated class in our universities. We have a political class, who occupy the halls of legislative power in our state capitals, in Congress, many of whom either don't know about these principles at all because they never learned them. They weren't taught them in school, or they kind of know about them and they actually reject them because you can't do well. It's hard to succeed as a progressive type, a politico type who wants to offer all kinds of free things and all kinds of regulatory, controls on and restrictions on our liberty. You can't do that if you actually believe in these principles. So we have an entire political class who's quite willing to set aside the principles so they can offer, lots of free stuff, alleged free stuff, taxpayer subsidized stuff, and the illusion of perfect safety by regulating and controlling and restricting every aspect of our lives. And those people who do that, they're the people who tend to stay in office for decades, because a lot of Americans like the promises of free stuff and they like the promise of perfect security. And what we ultimately need here is a cultural transformation. We need growing large numbers of Americans who demand to live freely, to demand to live as adult human beings, as free citizens who are going to govern ourselves and not have a political class pretending to be our parents as if we're perpetual children. And there's no better platform, there's no better lesson of how to live as a virtuous, self-governing, free human being than by studying the principles enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the other cultural lessons that come out of the American Revolution and the American founding.
Well, there's just so much here. I just appreciate everything you bring to this discussion and sort of your education of our listeners today on these topics. It's so great. If people want to know more about you, learn more, where can they find more about you, Dr. Krannawitter?
Best place to follow me, I have a very active Facebook page. So look me up on Facebook, Thomas Krannawitter. And also I have a Substack. So if you go onto Substack and just put in Krannawitter, you'll find me. It's called the Liberty Lyceum. That's a great way. I use Substack to send out essays, notifications of things that I'm doing. Those are probably the best way to follow my work.
All right. Well, we're going to have you back, and we've got 2 or 3 episodes coming more after this one. Just such great stuff. Hey, first of all, happy Independence Day to you too, Dr. Krannawitter.
Yes, absolutely. And I want to encourage everyone listening, when you get done, before you go eat your hot dogs and drink your cold beer and watch some fireworks, take a moment. It's not a long document. If you have kids, bring your kids around. Actually read the Declaration of Independence. Read it. Talk about it a little bit. You will be surprised at how it is not at all boring. And the ideas contained in that document resonate in our world today in all kinds of ways.
Yeah, what a great idea. Read the Declaration of Independence every Independence Day.
Yeah.
And share those thoughts. It was a great idea, and it took a lot of effort for our founders to bring it to fruition. So thank you again, Dr. Krannawitter. Appreciate you being with us.
Thank you, Jeff. Have a wonderful holiday.
Yes, you too. All right. Well, listen, these are the principles that we always talk about. Defending. This is what it's about. To be able to pass on this experiment that happened so many years ago, and we've generation from generation passed it on to the next. And that's our goal. That's our duty, really, is to pass it on to our children and to our grandchildren. Thank you for joining us on American Potential.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.